I am Jamie Allen Black, CEO of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York. On behalf of the entire foundation, thank you all for joining us today. At JWFNY, we pride ourselves on supporting our jewels, Jewish, entrepreneurial, women, executives, and leaders. These leaders use their Jewish values and a gender lens to solve intractable problems around the world, in the Jewish community and beyond. They are on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis, supporting women impacted by poverty, mass incarceration, gender violence, education, and as Lauren Hersh, our speaker today, will tell you, ending trafficking and exploitation. Lauren's organization, World Without Exploitation, works towards a world where no human being is bought, sold, or exploited. They directly support survivors as well as advocate for laws that hold traffickers accountable. After encountering gender violence in her career in the Kings County District Attorney's Office, Lauren realized that sex trafficking cases were largely unrecognized and worked to create one of the first sex trafficking units in the United States. Among Lauren's many accomplishments, she created the Teen Leadership Initiative, launched the Campus Gender Violence Initiative, and led a movement to pass the Trafficking Victims Protection and Justice Act in 2015. But we will let Lauren tell you more. And before we begin, just a tiny bit of Zoom housekeeping. If you have a question for Lauren, please send them directly to Natasha Mayer, host, by selecting her name in the chat box. We've muted you all to avoid background noise, so the chat feature is the best way to make sure your message or question is seen and the best way to chat with each other. If you're inspired by what you hear this afternoon and want to support our work, text JWFNY to 44321 to donate, and we'll put that in the chat. Your generosity helps us support Jewish women leaders and create a better future for women and girls. And now, I'm proud to introduce the president of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you, Jamie. Welcome, everyone. So happy to have you with us here today. And Lauren, so happy to have this opportunity to chat with you. You and I have had many occasions for the last year to talk about your work, and I look forward to sharing that with everyone here today. I know some of us will have met you, heard your story a little bit at the convening last year, but we certainly have a lot of new listeners here who are joining us today. You know, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to the work that you're now doing at World Without Exploitation?
Sure. Well, first of all, and most importantly, thank you so much to Jewish Women's Foundation of New York. It has been such an honor to be a jewel and to work beside you for the last year. You all have really done an extraordinary job of bringing people together and raising up the voices of many of us and also the communities we serve. So we're so grateful to you, Jamie, Rachel, and your team. And thank you to all of you for joining all of us today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you, Rachel. So by way of background, I promised I will get to your question, but I wanted to make sure to thank you. By way of background, I'm a lawyer by trade. I started my career, actually, it's been sort of a windy road, but I started my legal career at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. And at a time when, I went to the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office knowing that I wanted to work in the field of combating gender-based violence. But at the time, I didn't know what sex trafficking was. And so I was a domestic violence prosecutor handling all sorts of domestic violence cases, sex crimes that had a connection to intimate partner violence. And I sort of stumbled into this arena of sex trafficking. So I had a young woman who walked into my office. All the police paperwork sort of signaled that she had been beaten by her boyfriend. They had a long-standing relationship. And when she walked in, I sort of made a bunch of assumptions about who she was and what her relationship was like. And I sat down to do an interview with her, and the interview actually sort of changed the course of my life. I asked her a number of questions about her boyfriend and her relationship with her boyfriend. And I must have used the word boyfriend, I don't know, 57 times in 15 minutes. And every time I said the word boyfriend, she shut down and I couldn't make headway with her. So I spent a while kind of trying to get in a number of different ways. And I had always sort of prided myself on being victim-centered and making a good relationship, good connection with victims, but I could make no headway with this young woman. After, I don't know, an hour or so, I stopped the interview and I got her some food and had her to sit to relax. And I went actually to the place where I do my best thinking, which is the spin bike. And I jumped on a bike for 30 minutes and I started thinking about her and why I couldn't make headway. And I had this sort of moment where I thought to myself, maybe there's more to this situation and maybe there's more to this relationship. And maybe I need to stop making so many assumptions about who she is and what her relationship is like. So I went back into the interview room and I stopped using the term boyfriend. And I just started asking some open-ended questions. And it was at that point when it became abundantly clear that, yeah, she was in some sort of relationship with this guy, but that he was actually her pimp and under the law, her trafficker. And it was the first time that I think I began to put the pieces together that sex trafficking was happening here in the United States. And it was happening in our backyards, in all of our communities, and that it was mostly not recognized by prosecutors, by law enforcement, by the community at large. And so that was sort of my entryway into this world of combating exploitation. From there, it was a bit windy for me, but I ultimately recognized that I was probably not alone, that there were probably a lot of cases, much like this young woman who had come into my office with the police paperwork saying one thing, but the reality being something drastically different. And so I went up to the organized crime unit of the district attorney's office and I said, I think these cases exist. I think there's sex trafficking happening. This is around 2007, and there had been a new New York state law that had just been passed and was not being used. And I said, I think we can make these cases. And so the guy who headed up the organized crime unit was like, knock yourself out. And so I went up to the organized crime unit. I really knew nothing, Rachel. I mean, I had an instinct it was happening, and for the first year, I just listened to anybody who would talk about these cases. I didn't make a single case that first year. And then I began making cases. And what I began recognizing was that so much of the sex trafficking that was happening in New York City, I had thought that it was going to be foreign-born victims in faraway places who were being smuggled over international borders, but the reality was so different. The reality was that the vast majority of the cases that I saw as a prosecutor were American-born women and girls who were being exploited in our backyards, and they weren't being moved at all. And so the thing that they really had in common, the victims, was that they were women and girls, mostly of color, who were poor. And so it was sort of this intersection of gender inequality, racial inequality, and income inequality. So that's sort of my background. From there, I created one of the country's first sex trafficking units at a district attorney's office. I stayed there for a while, made a number of cases, and then I got to a point, and I'm assuming many of you can sort of relate to this, but I had really young children at home. I was working around the clock. I was finding myself sort of feeding my kids, bathing them, getting them to bed, and then running to a crime scene and pulling a 12-year-old out of a brothel or whatever it was. And I eventually said, can't do this anymore. Response is important. It's important to handle these cases. Prevention is everything. And so we got to find a way to prevent. And that's why we created World Without Exploitation, a national coalition to combat human trafficking and sexual exploitation. That was a lot of words.
It's an amazing story. And, it's interesting because we hear this theme a lot in our interviews with our jewels about, it comes from a lot of listening at the beginning, right? Listening to the community. What does the community need? And that's exactly what you did. And when you left that unit, did someone take it over and continue that work in your stead while you were doing this preventative work on the other side?
Yeah, it's a unit that still exists. And the great thing about it is that we started at the Brooklyn DA's office. And while I was there, I was working with prosecutors in Manhattan and in the Bronx and in Queens and in Staten Island. And now, over a decade later, there are units in pretty much every DA's office. And this is a crime that is being handled across the country. It's being handled it's a very serious crime, and it's being handled, I would say, pretty well in most places. But we're at a place right now where we understand the issue so much better than when I first created that sex trafficking unit. I think that, at that time, there was so much that was just completely unknown. I think if you turned on the television and you heard the word sex trafficking, you would hear about foreign-born victims in faraway places. Now it's sort of moved into this mainstream place where we understand that it's happening in our communities. And if we look the other way, we are watching, or we're ignoring the fact that our most vulnerable are being preyed on.
Yeah, and you shared some of the demographics of the people who are being preyed on, and I'm assuming that these are young girls too. I mean, what is the ages of the girls that you're meeting?
So it's interesting because there's a statistic out there that says that the average age, and it's not a statistic that I think is perfect, but it's worth sort of sharing because it'll give you a general idea. So the average age of entry into prostitution is somewhere between 12 and 14. Now, I can tell you anecdotally that the average age of a girl that I saw as a prosecutor was about 15 years old. And most would say that they had been in the life, that's sort of the language, for about 2 to 3 years. So that age, that 12 to 14 age, rings true to me. Now, I will say that people want to talk about child sex trafficking all the time. It's an easier conversation to have, that young people are being exploited. But now, doing the work that I do, I work with survivors from around the country, and many were exploited from the time that they were young. But the reality is, they don't become any less exploited once they have an 18th birthday. And so I think it is critically important not just to focus all of our attention on child victims, and to make sure that we're recognizing that it's not just girls or some boys, but women as well.
Yeah, for sure. And, what conditions exacerbate human trafficking and sexual exploitation? Or are there conditions, we see with gun violence, they talk about it being seasonally. There's a spike usually in the summer when more people are outside. Are there other conditions that exacerbate human trafficking and sexual exploitation?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. So a decade ago, I would have said the summer months were sort of hotter because, hotter, yes, and hotter, more prevalent, because girls were on the street more in the summer months. But now, with the shift from the street to online exploitation, I don't know that the summer months are any, there's any sort of spike in the summer months. The thing that I think is kind of critically important to recognize is there would be no sex trafficking if there were not demand for commercial sex. And so if we kind of take a step back and we think about what the conditions are, I think that the reality is that it's the sex buyers who are driving the market. They're fueling the market. And if there were no buyers consuming people in prostitution, there would be no business. Pimps would not be selling girls. And so for me, sort of that's the biggest condition, is a market for exploitation. And so when we think about, well, what is good practice? What are some good solutions? For me, I think it is critically important to make sure that we're not only holding accountable the demand for commercial sex buyers, recognizing who they are. They tend to be men with money and privilege. And we need to make sure that we're not only holding accountable those sex buyers, but also educating young people, especially boys, that there's a tremendous amount of harm from buying sex. And so I think that education piece is really key as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, so many of our jewels, their issue areas have been affected by COVID over the last several months. Has COVID affected human trafficking and sexual exploitation? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think anytime you deal with a vulnerable population and then you have something like a pandemic, you end up seeing vulnerable people become more vulnerable. So what we saw really early on was, for us, the way in to combat sexual exploitation. We want to make sure we're obviously holding accountable demand, but we're also providing exit strategies and services for people in prostitution. And those exit strategies and services became really, really hard in times during the COVID time. We also saw that, you know, that women who had exited prostitution and were relying on different types of jobs in the service industry, they lost their employment and they had no other way to sort of fund themselves. And so very often you end up seeing sort of a relapse back into the sex trade. So now maybe, you know, at one point they were pimp run, they were run by traffickers, and now they're like, okay, well, that's what I got. That's my only option. And we find with the vast majority of people in prostitution that they're not there by choice, they're there because of lack of options. And so when you have a pandemic and you have a vulnerable population, it sort of feeds back into a tremendous amount of exploitation.
Yeah. Talk a little bit more about those exit strategies that you mentioned and what they are and how you help people to implement them. What exactly does that all about?
So we at World Without Exploitation, we're a national coalition. So we have about 175 member organizations that are members of World Without Exploitation. We don't provide any direct services. We bring coalition partners together to leverage partnerships, to work on policy, to work on legislation, to lift up survivor voices. But many of the organizations that are under our World Without Exploitation umbrella are providing a whole host of exit strategies and services to women and girls. So they're anything from housing to all sorts of mental health provision, to education, employment, economic empowerment. We have one extraordinary organization that recognized pretty early on that the vast majority of people that were coming to them were exploited in prostitution, but also had substance abuse issues. And so they felt that in order to provide meaningful exit strategies and services, they needed to both help provide therapy for the prostitution, but also provide substance abuse treatment. And so many of our organizations are working in lots of different ways. And I think one of sort of the amazing things about what we're doing at World Without Exploitation is we're connecting partners together. So if a person has a substance abuse problem and is also struggling to exit prostitution, she may be provided services from one organization, and we're able to say, oh, but she also needs economic empowerment, or she also needs education, or she also needs housing, and we're able to connect. So we're sort of that connective tissue on a lot of fronts. And what we find, honestly, Rachel, is that that women, as they exit the sex trade, their needs are, there's such a there's such an array of needs. Some people need immigration relief. Some people need other forms of legal relief. A lot of the women that we work with, when they come to us, they have a huge, long rap sheet because they've been involved in all sorts of criminal activity as a direct result of their exploitation. And so we want to make sure that we're connecting them to lawyers who can vacate convictions, who can actually bring them to a place where they can fully exit and move on with their lives.
Yeah, it's a lot of moving parts.
A lot of moving parts. Yes.
And I imagine that your work as an organization and your work as connecting tissue and the work of your partner organizations was significantly impacted over the last 4 months. How was your work impacted, and what, if any, pivots did you make?
Was it only 4 months? Could it
5, 4?
It feels like a lifetime.
5, almost 5, I guess.
Okay.
Forever.
We've pivoted in so many different ways. So the thing that comes to mind first is that we, in March, when this all was going down, we were gearing up for our national conference for 300 people in Washington, D.C. We bring a ton of survivor leaders together and allies and people working in the space, and then also people working in foster care and other forms of children's services and in all different ways. And so we were bringing people together, and our team was calling me basically weekly saying, like, you sure this is going to happen? And I was like, yeah, it's going to happen. May, it's going to happen. And then they would call again and say, you sure this is going to happen? And when I finally admitted to myself that it wasn't going to happen, we made a really significant pivot in that we recognized that people still wanted to learn together, to grow together, and to strategize together. And so in mid-March, we launched a webinar series called Now and Next, and we ran weekly webinars. We originally started doing it thinking that we were going to bring together 100, 200 people. And over a couple of weeks, we started realizing that we were getting 1,500 people registering every week. And so sort of the amazing thing is that we were able to reach out and create a much broader community than we ever imagined possible. So that was incredible. The next thing that we did, everything sort of happens by accident. But the next thing that happened was every summer we run a youth summit for 150 to 200 young people in New York City. And we were all set to bail on it. We were not going to do it. There was no way to bring, 150 young people together for a day of education and activism. And so we said, we're not doing it. And then I had a couple of young people that worked with us last year, and they called me and they said, what do you mean? What do you mean you're not doing it? You're running these weekly webinars. Why is it that you're not going to run a youth summit for us? And I said, well, you're kind of right. If you help us, we'll do it. And so we put together a steering committee of 25 young people. They were amazing. High school students, college students, post-college young people. And the extraordinary thing is, week after week for 6 weeks straight, we had at least 20 to 25 people on the screen every single week organizing. They created incredible content. They created a video. They came to me. It turned out to be a 2-day event, not a 1-day, because 1 day wasn't enough. And now they're in the process of building a World We Youth Coalition. And we had not 150 young people, but we had 800 that registered from around the country. So it's been pretty wild. It's just been a kind of wild ride. And the way that we work at World We is we're all about sort of putting our ear to the ground and trying to be responsive to the needs of survivors and our partners and the young people that we work with. And we've had to be really, the great thing about us being a small organization is that we can be really nimble. And so I think it's paid off in really extraordinary ways that we couldn't have even imagined in March.
It sounds it. You're building an army. Tell us a little bit more about the summit, about some of the topics that you covered in the education part, and then how you activated these young people into being activists. I think we had some questions, and we'll get to too about what people can do, but I'd like to hear how you worked with the young people first.
Sure. So the most important thing for me when I work with young people is really listening to them about the issues that they're navigating. And one of the issues, so obviously issues of sex trafficking and prostitution and sexual exploitation, they're all issues that young people deal with, but not every young person in their everyday life. But what we heard was that young people on college campuses are inundated with requests to join a website called Seeking Arrangements. And what that is, it's a sugar daddy, sugar baby website where mostly young women are being sort of lured in to these sugaring situations where a sugar daddy will pay them X amount of dollars per month for their quote unquote companionship. But here's the key. If you have an EDU account, you actually get this service for free, right? You can enroll for free. So they're actually targeting girls with EDU accounts. The sugar daddies want these young, vulnerable girls. And the companionship, if you actually speak to anybody who's in a sugaring relationship, they will tell you, well, most will tell you, that there's an expectation for sex and all forms of like pretty sick stuff. And the sort of the hook is that in the event, and it's coercion, like in the most basic sense of the word, because what ends up happening is if the girl does not, perform whatever sort of sex act that sugar daddy wants, what does he do? Cuts her off. He moves on to the next girl. So it's extraordinarily coercive. So one of the things we knew we had to do, because we were hearing from the young people on our steering committee, was we had to do a workshop on sugaring. We did that. We found several survivors who explained to us that they were survivors of sugaring, but it actually fed them right into the belly of sex trafficking. So there was like a direct sort of link between the form of sexual exploitation that is sugaring and sex trafficking. So that was one thing. So we worked, so we did a workshop on sugaring. The other thing that young people are talking about, and for whatever the reason, we as adults are not doing a great job of talking with young people about it, but it's porn. And there's so much pornography, there's so much exploitation in pornography, and especially on a website called Pornhub. And so we brought in an expert who did a workshop on Pornhub. And what she actually told us was that on this porn website, they actually upload videos of women and some girls who are being sexually assaulted, and it's being sold to young people as pornography. Now, it's super complex, but those are two of the issues that we tackled. The third issue, we wanted to make sure that young people were hearing directly from survivors. At World Without Exploitation, we feel that it is critically important to not only listen to survivors and listen to their stories, yeah, important, but really the most important piece of listening to survivors is listening to survivors on good recommendations for policy and what works and what doesn't work. And so we actually launched our youth summit with a survivor speak out that tackled the really complex issues of legalizing the sex trade and what that looked like. And what survivors said was, we want people in prostitution to be decriminalized, not given criminal penalties. We want them to be given exit strategies and services, but at the same time, it is critically important that the law holds accountable those who exploit. the pimps, the sex buyers, and the brothel owners. And so, so the survivors at this Survivor Speak Out, we're calling for a model called the equality model, which does just that. Decriminalizes people in prostitution, giving them exit strategies and services, and simultaneously holding accountable those who exploit the buyers, the pimps, and the brothel owners.
Wow.
That's a lot, right?
Look, there are a lot of people on this call, myself included, who have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews of this age. And it's really hard to imagine that our college-bound children can be lured into these situations. And when you host this summit, I imagine, in a room full of 800 people, you might not know everyone's sort of status, and maybe this might uncover some issues for people who are participating. Are you supporting that at all in terms of providing them with resources for mental health support or whatnot if they need it?
It's such a good question. So interestingly, when I say that we were building community, both with our webinars and our youth summit, what actually happened was we had a lot of survivors who came our way who said, this happened to me, I never shared it with anybody. And so we were inundated with emails, and we spent a lot of time making a lot of referrals. So, it's complicated. Cracking open these really complex conversations, I think it's essential, but I think we have to do it with the expectation that we're going to have people who say, me too, this happened to me, and can you help? And because we are a national coalition, the beautiful thing about it was we were actually able to listen, to hear what people needed, and then connect them with organizations in all parts of the country. So that ended up being sort of a thing. I mean, I get anytime I talk, I feel like if I'm talking in a school or I'm talking, on a college campus or in a community center, I always have people that approach me. And so we're always super aware that will come our way. It is, we always make sure that we're very upfront about the content that we're about to discuss, and that for some people it can be either triggering or wildly empowering.
That's great. We had a question from one of our listeners. Are your participants all women, or are there young men as well?
Young men as well. I know I say women and girls because I mostly work with women and girls, but actually during our Survivor Speak Out, we had a young man, his name is Christian Eduardo, and he's actually New York based. And he is both a victim of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And he was part of that Survivor Speak Out, and he's actually emerged as a powerhouse survivor leader in New York, and we're actually doing some work in Louisiana, and he's now spearheading that work, that equality model work in Louisiana. So yes, we're working with both, we're working with women and girls and boys and men.
Right. And what's untapped for you? What's next on the horizon?
So we actually are on a bit of a break from our webinar series, which I'm so grateful for. I needed that 1 month to not have a Thursday afternoon with my kids like screaming, "Do I need to shut up now?" So we're on a month-long break, but we actually start up in September with our webinars once a month, not once a week, happily. But we're looking forward to doing the webinars again. We actually are in the process of building a team, a training and technical assistance team, to begin to move the equality model, that piece of legislation that I was just talking about, into a number of jurisdictions. So what we've seen is, and this is just sort of by way of background, but what we've seen is that a number of jurisdictions are really looking for change, especially with all the police reform initiatives that are so critically important. And so sort of the default position is decriminalizing the sex trade in its entirety. So in New York, in Louisiana, in California, there have been these bills that have been either introduced or sort of on the brink of being introduced to fully decriminalize the sex trade. Washington, D.C. was one of them. And so what these bills actually do is that they're, in my opinion, they're fully deceptive. Because what they actually do is they not only decriminalize people in prostitution, they don't provide any sort of exit strategies or services, and they also decriminalize, and this part's really important, they decriminalize pimping, sex buying, and brothel owning. And so these bills are deeply troubling. And so what we're doing is we're providing an alternative to these bills, and we're saying, yes, we are completely with you. We want police reform. We want criminal justice reform. We want to decriminalize people in prostitution and give them exit strategies and services. But it is a total mistake to decriminalize pimps, sex buyers, and brothel owners. And so we're building this training and technical assistance team and bringing it to different jurisdictions to introduce equality model legislation in some really important jurisdictions, such as New York.
Great. It's hard to imagine that legislation would include decriminalization for both, he or she who's being victimized as well as the perpetrator. That's sort of hard to even imagine.
Well, it's interesting because the way that it's being framed, so for example, in Washington, D.C., the way that the bill was written, it didn't say decriminalize pimping, because everybody would have gone crazy and said, no way. They were smart and somewhat deceptive and said decriminalize third parties. Another word for pimps, right? So I share this with you, with all of you, because I think there's a narrative out there that wants people to believe that full decriminalization of the sex trade actually helps people in the sex trade. And I think we need to sort of peel back the layers and recognize what these bills actually do, and also at the same time recognize that there is an alternative, a viable alternative that survivors support, and that's the equality model. Yeah.
Amazing work. We have some questions, which I'm going to feed in from some of our listeners. Is there anything more you can share? You talked a little bit about, whose most vulnerable populations are most at risk for human trafficking and sexual exploitation. In your anecdotal experience and or statistically, can you share a little bit more about, racially, how that might break down, in terms of religion, how that might break down? Are there differences? Are there some populations who are more at risk in that way? That was one question we had.
So here's what we know, and there are some statistics out there. They tend to be citywide statistics, not national statistics. But what we see in, like, I'll give you an example, like a place like Seattle that is predominantly white. The vast majority of those that are sold in the sex trade are women and girls of color, and so it's clear as day in a place like Seattle that disproportionately women and girls of color are being exploited. And what's also interesting, so that's who's being exploited, but when you actually look at the statistics for who the buyers are, they tend to be men with disposable income, many white. Now here's when I get to say, we know that the vast majority of people who buy sex are men, but what we also know is that the vast majority of men don't buy sex. So this is not an indictment on men in general, and actually it's a really important part of the conversation, I think, because I think what we want to be able to say to men is, if we're going to make a dent in this issue, it can't be by hundreds of women coming together and just talking to ourselves. We need to make sure that we're engaging in a meaningful way with men and boys, and being very honest about who the buyers are, who the bought are. Now, also, in addition to sort of that racial breakdown, we know that that poor women and girls tend to be targeted for all the reasons that you may suspect. right? So somebody said to me the other day, like, I think I got like a Facebook post or something about a person who was in the car with her 2 daughters, and this trafficker came next to her and started like this wild chase, and it was kind of like the movie Taken. That's not how it happens, right? That's not how it happens at all. And so it's really important to break down these myths. What the reality is very often it's women and girls who are living in poorer areas, like at a place like Covenant House. We end up finding a lot of homeless youth or foster care kids who are being preyed on. They tend to be young people, right? Young, that's definitely a factor, and young people who don't often know where they're laying their head, or they don't often know where they're getting their next meal. And so the way these traffickers or pimps kind of come at them, they're promising these young people a better life, a meal. You know, I had a girl who came into my office, and the guy said to her, like, I'll take you to McDonald's and buy you a Happy Meal. That's all it took, right? And so that piece is really important. The other part of the equation that we have to talk about is that LGBTQ youth are disproportionately vulnerable, and especially young people in the transgender community. We end up finding that we hear all the time from trans people who are saying, I was lured in because I had no better option. Right? There was no employment option for me. My parents didn't want me to be in my house, or whatever it was. And so we need to be talking about sort of the intersectionality of all of these issues and all of these root causes, right? We can't just be, playing whack-a-mole with sex trafficking, but we need to make sure that we're tackling racial inequality, gender inequality, income inequality, inequality with LGBTQ and youth and young people in general. Now, you asked me about religion, and here's what I get to say to you. I'd love to tell you that Jewish women and girls were not susceptible, but the reality is that they are, that we're finding more and more that traffickers are using mainstream social media to target women and girls, mostly girls. And so I had a situation with a number of young girls who received Instagram messages, like a DM. And when we unpacked it, it was from a trafficker. And it was very much like, you want to make some extra dollars, you're very pretty, you're whatever it is. And so we had young people who responded. So while we know that, that it tends not to be, wealthier white girls, it happens. And I've had a number of cases with Jewish girls. And so that's why it's critically important to be educating everywhere with young people about this issue.
Yeah. I have so many questions from people, so I'm going to just keep launching. Just a question, is it mostly money? Are drugs ever involved? Are drugs used as a lure?
Yes, but drugs sometimes they're used as a lure, but very often they're used to maintain control over a girl. So other things may have lured her in, but so I'll give you an example. I had a young woman who I was prosecuting her trafficker, and I was trying to understand sort of the complexities of the case. And one of the things that she said to me was, he kept me high all the time. And I said, like, what do you mean? And she said, oh, like it wasn't cocaine. Definitely wasn't crack. It was a lot of marijuana. And I said, well, tell me about that. Let me understand that better. And she said, actually, he would like constantly give me weed because when I was sober, I would fight back. And when I was high, he would just be able to get me to do whatever he wanted me to do. And so there was that piece. I've also heard a number of survivors say that crack wasn't really used because that's not a drug that would be used, because at some point she'd be so addicted, and there's so many other, like she would go skinny and right? And you're still, that pimp is still trying to sell her. And so a lot of ecstasy, a lot of marijuana, maybe a little bit of cocaine here and there, but drugs were used to sort of maintain control.
Yeah. You talked a lot about education and the need to educate. And is that part of the work that WWE is doing, or some of your partner organizations? Are you collaborating with schools? Are you developing curriculum around this? How do we go about educating our youth?
Yeah, well, so our partner organizations do this, but we also do it because I love it. It's actually my favorite part of the job. I love being in spaces with young people. And I love being able to crack open real and raw conversations with young people, because I actually think young people are so hungry for you to keep it real with them. They don't want to pretend. They don't want to have, these pretend, they want, like, the minute I go into a space and I just like, I open it up to, I will take any question at all. I feel like that is sort of the best way in. And so what am I doing? I'm kind of anywhere. I will go to any school. But this year I worked in 2 different school programs over a long period of time. And it was sort of my favorite part of the week, each week. So I worked at the Bergen Family Center in New Jersey with young people from Englewood who are really at risk. And I also began working with Cristo Rey schools in Harlem. And those young people were super at risk. But what I ended up finding was that they were the fiercest advocates. And because it was happening in their community, they not only wanted to learn about it, they wanted to learn, what can I do? And so we ended up with like 5 of those young people, both young men and young women, high school students, on our youth summit committee, and they were amazing. So, we're doing a ton of work in lots of different schools, but I love the ongoing work, because I think that in order to really create the next generation of activists, we need to give meaningful space for conversation, but also room for them to activate in a whole host of ways. And every time I'm in a room with young people, I'm just blown away.
They're an amazing generation, these young people. They are.
Yes.
Tell me, the girls, what happens to the girls if they don't have an exit strategy and they're caught, they're arrested? Where are they being processed? Is it within a youth facility? Is it? I mean, does it really depend on their age? I mean, what's happening to these girls if they're found?
So we're in a really big fight right now to make sure that we're not criminalizing any people in prostitution, sort of recognizing that most people don't land there by choice, right? They land there because they can't put food on their table, or because they can't put Pampers on their children, or because they've been lured in at 12 and then know nothing else. And so this is a place where we've made a lot of progress. And I think it's really important to sort of recognize where progress is being made. And so in New York City, there's a really big push not to criminalize people in prostitution, and to make sure that they're getting exit strategies and services and not criminal records. And there are different jurisdictions sort of all over the country that are doing this really well, and there are jurisdictions and places in the country that are doing this really poorly. And what ends up happening is, I'll just give you an example. So I worked with a judge in New York City who says this best. He would find that when a young person would come in with a prostitution case, very often there'd be a dude in the back waiting. And so if that young person was being released, they were being released to the hands of their pimp, who was standing in the back of the room. And so, so that's really changed in New York. We're really not criminalizing young people for prostitution, and mostly not criminalizing adults either, and really trying hard to vacate convictions.
That's great.
But one more thing, Rachel.
Oh,
really
yeah.
quick.
Please.
Sorry. But you asked, like, well, what happens if they're criminalized? And the short answer is, if people are criminalized, they're either fed back into their pimp's arms, or they're fed back into the streets or online, and then they're sort of back into the world of exploitation. And so criminalization of people in prostitution makes zero sense.
I'm hearing you. We really only have time for 2 more questions. So second to last question, how has your Judaism affected your work?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's affected me in so many different ways. I think, like, I don't know whether it's Judaism or the way, like, my family and their traditions, which I guess are Jewish traditions, but there was always in my home, like, a very clear message that you go out and you do good for the world. Like, that has to be a part of everything that you do. And like, it's funny, my son is studying for his bar mitzvah, and that's really been sort of a big theme in his bar mitzvah lessons, and his learning with the rabbi and our Hebrew school. So I think that piece, I don't know. I think that's sort of like that family piece, the Judaism piece. I think all sort of, for me, it's really kind of linked together.
100%. It was one of the first questions we had, but it seems best to end with. And you and I talked about this. What can we do? What can we do for prevention? What can we do for activism in terms of supporting some of these initiatives that you've talked about today? What takeaways can you give us?
So, a couple. One, I think the more you know, the better you do. And so I think for me, listening to survivors is sort of ground zero. And so I guess if people wanted to do something today, tomorrow, a month from now, I would encourage people to listen. We have our webinars are on our website, worldwithoutexploitation.org. And there are a number of webinars that feature survivors and feature survivors actually talking about what good policy and good legislation looks like. That's one. So listening to survivors and sort of that being a great vehicle to do so. 2, there's going to be some legislation coming down the pike in New York, equality model legislation. I think you all talk to lots of people, and helping them understand what full decriminalization actually is, and why the equality model is critically important. So that's 2. And then I'll just sort of make a shameless plug for World Without Exploitation. When we hosted one of our last webinars, we had a number of survivors who were speaking, and it just blew me away. And so we created these masks, Speak Truth to Power, and it's part of a mask series, Vote for a Better World, Equal Not Exploited. And so with any donation to World Without Exploitation, you'll get one of these masks. And so that's my shameless plug.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So appreciate you taking this time with us today. You're doing incredible work, and we at the foundation are very, very proud to be supporting you. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Jamie now.
Hi again, Lauren. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom with us. I learned so much, and I saw people like furiously writing on their notepads. Thank you also, Rachel, for the great conversation. I learned so much. I hope everybody else did as well. from American-born boys and girls being exploited in our own backyards to the needs to teach all of our kids and grandkids about porn and identify some of the red flags they might see online, no matter how challenging those conversations can be. Judaism, as Lauren mentioned, is about action, so we can't stand idly by. To help you with that, I just want to highlight the actions you can take to help end trafficking and exploitation. You can support Lauren and World Without Exploitation by following and engaging in their social media. Her website is in the chat. Tomorrow, we'll send you the website again, and we'll also send you a link to Lauren's speaker series, Now and Next, which she mentioned. It resumes on September 10th, but you can go to her website and catch prior webinars with topics like criminal justice reform, racial justice, and online exploitation. Watch them with your families. And by supporting Lauren and World Without Exploitation, you work toward a future where no individual is bought, sold, or exploited. And our September speaker is Miriam Kabakov, Executive Director of ASHL. She works to create a better future for LGBTQ individuals in the Orthodox community and their families. So save the date, Thursday, September 3rd at 4 p.m. to hear how Miriam and her team are opening hearts, minds, and doors in the Orthodox community. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you all for being here, and we will see you next month.
Thank
Have
you
a great
so much.
night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.